Hello everyone, happy not so new year and best wishes for 2021. Thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to those in the US joining us on Martin Luther King Day, but also special thanks to Salim. I wasn't sure if he would make it for the start of the session because he is of course hosting this whole event, but great that you can make it, Salim. My name is Simone van Kaart and I'm the head of programs at the Global Resilience Partnership. It's my honor to welcome you to this GRP organizational session. And we've decided to dedicate it to the Resilience Knowledge Coalition, you should see here in bold letters. Specifically, we will focus this session today on resilience measurement, as it also demarcates the transition of the resilience measurement evidence learning community of practice into the coalition. As requested by Salim and others, I'm sure, I'll go over the contents real briefly before handing over to Nathaniel Matthews to give us an update on the GRP. Salim, if you want, you can give us a brief opening as well. We were hoping Shanaz Musa from South North could join us. She's indisposed, so maybe you can present some opening remarks in addition to your closing remarks. We have two panels for today. The first one is on advancing resilience measurement in the 2020s. We'll kick that off with a presentation by Dorcas Robinson, the outgoing director of the RMEL COP. And then we'll have a panel with very interesting contributions, and we'll introduce them when we're closer to that session. It's followed by a second panel where we are talking about how to shape action and guide locally-led adaptation, kicked off by a presentation from Tamara Kozier. And then we'll finish off with closing and next steps. Now, as you can see, we have quite a full agenda today with a very interesting presentation and panels. And we were not sure actually how many people would join and how interactive the session could be. So we have not included a lot of time for Q&A during the session itself. So please go ahead and use the chat to engage in discussion with each other. And if there is interest, we can extend the session for an additional 30 minutes or so to continue after it finishes officially, to have a discussion with panelists and presenters. But let's see how it goes. I think that's it for me for now. Over to Nathaniel or to Salim.
Thanks, Simona. Salim, if you're okay, I'll just go first with a few opening remarks and then you can jump in and pick up after me anything else I might have missed. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We're really excited for this session. Just wanted to provide a bit of an intro onto GRP for those who may not be familiar with it. We're a partnership of over 60 public and private organizations working together to ensure that we're more than the sum of our parts and to help build a resilient future for all, especially the most vulnerable. We focus our work across four main areas, and these can usefully be summed up as innovate, share, convene, and advance. And in our work on innovation, we work really on scaling and finding a safe space to test and build disruptive, bold ideas for resilience. Our work on sharing, especially where this work is focused, the Resilience Knowledge Coalition, is about how to take the practical understanding of how resilience is programmed and mainstream in practice and really work with partners to develop the latest knowledge on that. Our work on convening diverse voices is about how we focus our attention on policy and investment to support resilience actions. And our work on advancing the collective knowledge about resilience, or advancing, is really how we work with partners to ensure that the knowledge on resilience is achieving its long-term human well-being and its focus on maintenance of life support systems. And I think just to focus on resilience, we've seen with COVID how it's exposed really the fragilities in our systems and a lack of resilience that we have to interconnected shocks. And a key principle of resilience is adaptive learning. And that's the ability for us to really detect changes, learn from them, and tailor strategies accordingly. We know for a fact that our current dominant governance and response structures that really focus on a top-down approaches and short-term cycles aren't able to effectively deal with these interconnected challenges facing vulnerable people and communities. And this is really one of the main reasons why we set up with ICAD and South North the Resilience Knowledge Coalition. And this session builds on a process that Simona can outline a bit more, but that we started last year. And it's also in a way an invitation for many of you to engage in that process. We're excited about the Resilience Knowledge Coalition. We're committing to it for a number of years, and we think it's really a key part of that adaptive learning, and that recognizing that that's an essential component of resilience building. Salim, I'll hand it over to you if there's anything you'd like to add.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nate. So let me just add a few thoughts or perspectives from my point of view, and that's to do with the juxtaposition of two words, adaptation and resilience, and why that happens and how that gets operationalized and where is that relevant is sort of my area of interest. So the word adaptation comes very much from the world of climate change, the scientific world in the IPCC, and the political world in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where adaptation to climate change is very well defined in that it is about preparing for the adverse impacts due to human-induced climate change and being adapted or prepared for them in various ways. And that has become a major element of the UN Framework Convention and also the IPCC over the years, as our efforts to reduce emissions to a level where we wouldn't have human-induced climate change have failed. And we are now seeing human-induced climate change due to more than 1 degree centigrade rise of temperature above pre-industrial. Even though we keep it below 1.5 degrees, nevertheless, we are seeing impacts and we are having to adapt to them. So it's a very somewhat narrowly constructed concept of adapting to human-induced climate change, not just any types of climatic events. And then we have the word resilience. The word resilience actually does not find a place in the UN Framework Convention because it's deemed to be somewhat amorphous and ill-defined, and we can't agree on a definition. So in the UN Framework Convention, the words resilience don't appear, but the word adaptation does. And the combination of the two words is, in my view, an attempt to operationalize the practice of adapting and building resilience. So adaptation to climate change specifically, but building resilience beyond climate change. And the COVID-19 pandemic impact is a very good example of having to adapt to the pandemic and build resilience to the pandemic. Is not a climate change specific task, but it is very similar to what we have to do in adapting to climate change as well. And so going forward, this pair bond, if you like, of words, adaptation and resilience, have a very close affinity to each other, particularly in the practical sense of knowing what to do, learning what to do, and then based on learning what to do, doing it even better. So it's a learning by doing process. You do something, you learn from that, and then you do even better, and then you learn from that, and then you do even better. So it's a stepwise learning process in which we improve our knowledge and ability to carry it out. And that's what the Resilience Knowledge Network, at least in my perception of it, is aiming to do. And then related to that, and I'll end with this comment, I will focus on how the theme of the Gobeshona Conference, which is on locally led adaptation, fits into this. It fits into this notion of adaptation to climate change, but it specifically focuses on who adapts. And it normatively says we are thinking about the most vulnerable communities and how they might adapt and how we as outsiders can help them to adapt better and enhance their ability. And the phrase locally led adaptation is now the phrase that we use. Used to be community-based adaptation, local adaptation. There's a variety of terminology, but locally led is now a sort of umbrella term where the focus is on leadership emanating from the vulnerable communities and not just seeing them as targets of top-down efforts, which is what the older paradigm was. And so what we are hoping to do in the Gobeshona Conference over the next 6 days that we have left, and then in the future, we see this as the first of this new series of global conference on locally led adaptation. And then we will continue this every year. In January, we will reconvene and we will take stock of, are we making progress? If so, how are we making progress? And how can we use the fact that we're making progress to accelerate progress going forward? And so we are hoping that the locally led adaptation leading to resilience, so locally led adaptation and resilience is a goal that we are trying to achieve as part of our networking effort in the Gobeshona Conference and continuing this networking effort going forward. So as members of the GRP, we are very, very interested in enhancing our networking capabilities and possibilities, and already stuff that we are doing, particularly the voices from the front lines that we collaborated on. And we have produced a very interesting policy brief on, which I announced this morning in the opening session, and it's now available for those of you who wish to download it. It was a very good experience of learning from the front lines, from the vulnerable communities in the context of COVID-19, but also in the broader context of what they can do and how we can learn lessons and how we can improve communication with and involvement of and engagement with the vulnerable communities as we try and build resilience going forward and be able to measure resilience as we take it forward as well. So from my point of view, I'm very pleased that GRP and partners in South, South, North and others to have this session, brought in a lot of very interesting speakers and organizations to share their experience. And I look forward to learning from all of them. I'll try and stay till the end, but I'm not quite sure I'll be able to. I may have to rush off to another session. But thank you very much for inviting me, Simone and Nate. Please carry on. Thank you.
No worries, Salim. It's our pleasure. Thanks, Nate, and thanks, Salim, for that great introduction, update, and the framing of the discussion. Now it's back to me again to give you a really brief background on what this Resilience Knowledge Coalition we have been talking about is. First of all, as you noticed and as already mentioned, this is not something that's driven by GRP alone. It's being co-led by ICAT, so thanks, Salim and LAC, as well as CDKN and South, South, North. It started about, I think, a year ago or a bit longer, when GRP and the other co-leads started consulting with a wide range of partners on co-creating this Resilience Knowledge Coalition. We've had our last call, a plenary call, on the 9th of November. Before that, we had working group calls, a call on the 1st of July, and a series of calls ahead of that. And the consensus of these various calls was that there is indeed a need for a coalition, and the focus and purpose of this should be to overcome the main challenge of getting knowledge into use and to get it actually to inform policy, investment, and practice. Another thing that came through these calls quite clearly, and that we're all in agreement on, is that the coalition should focus on a few functions, not trying to do everything. They should build on and add value to existing work of partners, so not reinvent the wheel. And also that we should be designing by doing, should be learning by doing, as Salim also said. So not trying to get stuck in lengthy MOUs or framework arrangements or strategy development, but we're kicking off, we're co-creating with you, and this session is part of that. Another point that came through very strongly, and that is core to the purpose of and objective of the coalition, is to be genuine on making Global South demand and expertise center stage. The second panel will also directly speak to locally-led adaptation, already mentioned and introduced by Salim. On the scope and in relation to comments on adaptation and resilience, it's agreed that initially we should not maybe be too broad, but focus on climate change, climate adaptation, given this year and importance of that. Also looking at COVID-19, but eventually the aim is to cover all shocks and risks across the resilience spectrum. So not to be specific to climate adaptation alone. Another What we will do is we will focus on specific themes, and one of those themes or areas where we will be more focused is resilience measurement. And we're kicking that work off with this session today. We have signed up, or we are signing up, in the process of signing up to the Race to Resilience, and we have provided information on this Race to Resilience that was launched recently in the newsletter that went out to the Resilience Knowledge Coalition members, but also the RMEL CUP members. We are aiming to be a sister to the proposed Adaptation Research Alliance. This is a sister to our coalition, and they having their launch event on Sunday. So we urge you to join that as well. And of course, we're very thankful to our funders, HIDA and USAID, who are funding both the GRP and the coalition, at least up to 2024, but hopefully for longer than it. Okay, before I hand over to Dorcas for her presentation, you have to stick with me a bit longer as I introduce this first panel on advancing resilience measurement in the 2020s. Through this panel, we will offer perspectives on what resilience measurement has achieved over the past decade and the opportunities for a next generation of resilience measurement to further support research into action into the 2020s. We'll start off this session by a brief or a bit more detailed presentation by Dorcas Robinson. Then following a panel discussion with Brett Segara, Colin McQuiston, Garrett Shisha, and Alison Quinlan. But before all that, I will take a bit more of your time to really briefly introduce a paper that I co-authored with my colleagues, Lindsay Jones, Mark Constance, and Nate Matthews on advancing resilience measurement. This was published actually just the 4th of January, so really recently on Nature Sustainability. And it identifies 4 priorities for advancing resilience measurement. The first is to promote shared principles for resilience measurement to harmonize measurement approaches. The second one is to leverage new technology and data opportunities, such as machine learning, for example. The third priority is to encourage rigorous impact assessment, and we strongly stress that there needs to be mixed methods impact assessments, so a strong focus on qualitative tools as well. And finally, that we need to generate evidence that informs policy and practice. Now, these priorities are not just ourselves of the co-authors, but are actually coming from a discussion we had with leaders from national governments, so locally-led adaptation informed by resilience measurement, UN agencies, and also measurement experts at a high-level consultation on resilience evidence and measurement that we held in Dakar, Senegal. Now, unfortunately, Mark and Lindsay were not available today, and as Nathan and I are already quite speaking a lot today, I was keen to keep this short, but hopefully this provides some food for thought for this first panel. And now over to Dorcas.
Thank you, Simona, and welcome everyone to this first panel. So as Professor Salim said, resilience is an intuitively meaningful but operationally elusive term. Yet about 10 years ago in the development and humanitarian assistance world, we saw an increased use of the concept of resilience coming up in strategies and program documents of agencies, grappling with a stronger realization that sort of pathways to development are not assured, that we are living in an increasingly complex world. And alongside this uptick in use of the concept of resilience, we saw a rise in kind of efforts to grapple with resilience measurement, because at the heart of the challenge of resilience is addressing questions such as, how do you know when you've strengthened it? What does it look like? What interventions should you be implementing in the name of strengthening resilience? So in 2016, the Resilience Measurement Evidence and Learning Community of Practice was launched with support from the Rockefeller Foundation. And since 2019, we have been hosted and championed by the Global Resilience Partnership. We have had about 250 resilience measurement and program specialists involved in the community of practice, coming from about 90 organizations. And the ambition of this community was really how we could further advance together resilience measurement, scale up learning around what works for strengthening resilience, and ultimately be generating knowledge to strengthen the evidence base to make the case for investments in resilience. In 2018, we hosted the Resilience Measurement Evidence and Learning Conference with 200 delegates, and we produced a fascinating proceedings document which gives you great insight into the diversity across this field of resilience measurement, but also the depth of learning around approaches, methods, and tools. The products that we've produced as a community of practice are all online. You can find them through the tiny URL here, RMEL box, and I think that will go up in the chat as I'm speaking. And my high-level comments today are drawn from this body of work that's been generated through the community of practice. Next slide, please, Simona, thanks. So as Simona indicated, I'm going to be joined by a panel of 4 members of the community of practice: Brad Segara from Mercy Corps, Colin McQuiston of Practical Action, Garrett Shishay of Chorus International, and Alison Quinlan of the Resilience Alliance. I'm going to present 3 high-level contributions that resilience measurement has made to the practice field and 3 high-level challenges and opportunities as we move forward. I just wanted to start by highlighting this comment from a panelist at the 2018 conference, who was really getting us to focus attention on the fact that while we have worked to develop resilience measurement tools through the past decade, this has been somewhat from a reactive perspective, looking at shocks and thinking about how we can improve responses to specific shocks. The challenge moving forward is that we need to have more proactive methods and tools and knowledge and learning in order to grapple with the rapidly changing world. Thanks, Simona, if you could advance the slide. So over the past decade, we have seen the emergence of a variety of approaches to resilience measurement. So just to give you some examples of the FAO's Resilience Index Measurement Analysis, or RMEL tool, the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance developed the Flood Resilience Measurement for Communities approach. We have research methods like the Recurrent Monitoring Survey approach developed by Tango International with USAID's Center for Resilience. This knowledge product that the Community of Practice produced in 2016 with the Overseas Development Institute is a sort of basic inventory of resilience measurement frameworks in 2016. And one of the takeaways from this analysis was that different resilience measurement frameworks have been designed for different functions, or maybe combinations of functions. So you find them designed for diagnostic and or evaluative and or planning purposes, and they're all slightly different in their emphasis. Having said that, although there's diversity in these approaches, there's been important convergence around the resilience concept through this work. Next slide, please, Simona. So one of the first high-level contributions I wanted to touch on is convergence around working definitions of resilience. So an understanding of resilience for development, which helps to frame what will be measured. Many of the frameworks that you will read about in the inventory are focused on this understanding of resilience for development and have similar definitions as the one I've shared here from the Technical Working Group for Resilience Measurement within the Food Security Information Network. This says that resilience is the capacity that ensures adverse stresses and shocks do not have long-term adverse development consequences. So this is where we're looking at resilience over time as people's pathways to development, or as the Chronic Poverty Reduction report says, a sustained escape from poverty is not thrown off by shocks and stresses over time. And with this kind of definition, then you can get into some important questions which allow themselves to be measured. So resilience of what, or resilience for whom? Resilience to what kinds of shocks and stresses are you concerned with, and how are you measuring those? Resilience through what are the capacities or the sources of resilience that help people and communities advance in the face of shocks and stresses? And finally, what are the well-being outcomes that you seek? What are the measurable outcomes that you are seeking to track and ensure are on track through your resilience measurement frameworks? Thanks, Simona, for the next slide. So to focus on a second high-level contribution, while there is no single resilience metric or system of metrics, these different resilience measurement platforms have in their own way increasingly created a system that helps to make resilience measurement relevant, accessible, and useful for the target decision makers that they have in mind. So have built empirically tested measurement systems designed for that system. For example, flood resilience for communities. Increasingly, we've also seen some of these platforms creating accessible and user-friendly guidance, tools, and trainings. So I've highlighted here, for example, the USAID-supported Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning platform, which provides tools and online training for USAID missions and partners to learn about how to measure resilience within the context of USAID funding. The other piece, of course, is that each of these systems provides motivational metrics that help decision makers. These might be in the form of dashboards or evaluations. But also some of these initiatives have begun to model the return on investment to resilience interventions and resilience efforts. And that's an important aspect of this work moving forward to inspire different kinds of investors to support resilience. Thanks, Simona. And finally, the third, if you could go to the next slide, thanks. The third level of contribution is that there's been a great deal of learning in this sort of practice and measurement space around what are the key ways of working and funding that are important to programming and taking action on resilience moving forward. So increasingly, we're seeing agencies with design and implementation and monitoring approaches that focus more on how shocks and stresses may impact a program's intentions moving forward, that think more about integration and the opportunities and potential for linking projects, or how you sequence your interventions or bring interventions together, and how that might be important to supporting the sources or capacities for resilience. And finally, guidance, which is paying more attention to anticipating the need for adaptive management and thinking about the role of monitoring, like more like evaluative monitoring than accountability monitoring. How do you how do you track change over time and are able to respond proactively when the people you're working with experience a shock or significant change? Thanks. So in terms of challenges and opportunities moving forward, there are three important themes that have run through the discussion since the formation of the community of practice. And the first of these is the importance of learning to measure and explore dynamics across systems and scales. I think most resilience programmers and practitioners acknowledge that they understand that there are relationships between systems. So for example, the health of a watershed is critical to downstream impacts in terms of water quality or flood management. But it can still be challenging in practice to both assess and diagnose those relationships between systems and then find points of leverage for change in the system. I just wanted to highlight here that this is work that's being explored by networks like the Resilience Alliance, which has been applying 7 principles for building resilience to understanding social ecological systems, and specifically being able to then think about where you could move for change in those systems moving forward. The second big takeaway and opportunity moving forward is the need to invest more meaningfully in the learning of measurement, evaluation, and learning. Resilience principles such as flexibility and adaptability imply that learning by doing or learning to fail and move fast, forward fast are essential to resilience practice, but all too often, as Professor Salim said, the people and the communities on the front lines of navigating their resilience challenges are not in the driving seat of the learning, or the program teams don't have adequate time and resources to support reflective learning processes with communities and decision makings. So we need to make sure that learning is really centered in the discussions around resilience programming and resilience measurement. And thirdly, we need to focus more on deepening our understanding of what it takes to promote transformational change. The concept of transformation is strong in resilience thinking and practice, but evaluations are finding that this is an area that program initiatives get stuck. It's very hard often to appreciate what the nature of transformational actions needs to be, what interventions can best promote transformation. So this is an area that requires more attention as we move forward. And particularly as more and more people and places are going to need to leapfrog or change some fundamentals in the system in order to cope with the nature of change that we're grappling with. Thanks, Simone, if you could go forward. So I'm going to stop there and welcome the panel to share their reflections on this, this field of resilience measurement. Brad, if you'd like to start, and you can bring everyone else in. We've got Brad, Colin, and Garrett, and Alison. Thank you. Brad, go ahead.
Thank you, Dorcas and Simone, for hosting this important panel, and thank you to the attendees for joining us. As Dorcas mentioned, Mercy Corps has been actively involved in the RMEL community of practice, and we're looking forward to this next chapter with the Resilience Knowledge Coalition. We've been working in the resilience measurement and programming space for about a decade now, which is, when you say it out loud, it seems hard to believe. But I decided for today, rather than giving a retrospective of all of our foundational work in this space, I thought I would share a small selection of where we're working now that I think aligns well with some of the contributions and opportunities that Dorcas just went over. So I'm currently Mercy Corps' lead on the Resilience Evaluation Analysis and Learning, or REAL award that Dorcas mentioned. And I see our fearless leader, Tom Spangler, among our attendees as well. So welcome, Tom, glad to have you. But the REAL award is funded by the USAID Center for Resilience, and in September of last year, it was awarded a 5-year follow-on, and so we're in a transition period between the two phases of the award. And the consortium consists of, is led by Save the Children, Mercy Corps, and Tango International. And we have a broad and diverse audience of among USAID missions, host governments, implementing partners, and other key stakeholders working in both the resilience measurement and resilience programming space. And so today, I wanted to focus on 2 out of the 3 purposes that the REAL award is focusing on moving forward that I think speak to these challenges and opportunities. And the first is, Dorcas had illustrated one of our guidance note series looking at cost-benefit analysis. We're going to continue to issue guidance notes like that. It might be a slightly different series, but one of the frontier issues that we've identified is focusing on measuring and strengthening the resilience of critical systems. This is kind of aligns with that, the first opportunity that Dorcas mentioned. So currently, this work stream is focusing on market systems, and it's using mixed method research, exploring what constrains or enhances market systems resilience to kind of inform and adapt measurement frameworks to ultimately evaluate what works and what leverage points work for building market systems resilience. And ultimately, this will culminate in guidance that we will issue for various systems level resilience design, assessment, and measurement methods. The second purpose I wanted to talk about today is facilitation of translating this knowledge and evidence into practice. And I'm particularly excited about this work stream. I think it's, as Dorcas said, becoming much more intentional about learning. And this is one of the, I think, many lessons learned that we had from the roughly 4 or 5 years of the first phase of the REAL award. And what we're doing is we're undertaking what we call a resilience learning journey approach. And this is our attempt to be very intentional and demand-driven, providing timely evidence that is very fit for purpose. And so we're still working on what that process looks like, but it's going to be very focused on country level and field level stakeholders, working with them to define what their resilience learning agenda is and identify how we can invest in strategic evidence building, build their own foundational knowledge and capacity, and finally take what that targeted investment in research and evaluation tells us to learn, reflect, and adapt through quick feedback loops and iterative adaptation. So I'm afraid with the amount of time I haven't really been able to do Mercy Corps' work or the real award the full justice. So I do encourage folks to click on the link that Ida shared. Thank you for doing that, Ida. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to direct message me in the chat. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to, I believe, Colin, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Brett. Over to Colin. Oh, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hello. So I'm Colin McQuiston. I'm the head of climate resilience at Practical Action, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who's joined this session. It's difficult to try and summarize the work that Practical Action and I've been involved in on resilience in 4 minutes, but I'm going to make the best journey that I possibly can to just try and talk about some of the work that we've done. And the key piece of work that I'm going to be talking about is the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, the work that we've been involved in since 2012, which has been mentioned in the presentation by Dorcas around developing a flood resilience measurement framework for communities to help them build their resilience to flooding. Now, Practical Action, as Brad mentioned, Mercy Corps have been in the field for over 10 years. We've been in the field for over 10 years, and we produced a paper back in 2008 called From Vulnerability to Resilience. And what we were trying to do with that paper was try and understand what is it that at the community level individuals can do to actually improve their resilience to the shocks and stresses around them. And I think the key here is, a core to the Gobeshona Conference is we need to make resilience building something that is locally led, and we need to build from local capacity, and we need to meet local aspirations. Now, fortunately, 2013, we joined the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and that alliance has been growing since then. And many of the organizations on the call today are partners in that alliance. And what we did very early on was develop a resilience framework. We built that on established best practice, so using participatory tools, using existing good community engagement approaches. It's quite a complex tool in that it was initially 88 sources, it's now only 44 sources of resilience. It's based on the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, so it builds on the 5 capitals, but it also uses resilient functions, and it looks at that across the community and tries to develop a process whereby you can actually use a risk management approach to assess their resilience at that moment in time. It uses mixed methods because we recognize that there is existing data, but you also need to collect data. And fundamentally, I think the important thing is it's an engagement process. You engage that community, you discuss with that community, and you try and identify what it is that those communities can do. Now, when I say community, we've operated it in both developing and developed countries. We've piloted it in rural, remote communities, and we've also piloted in urban communities. And in urban context, when you talk about community, that doesn't often mean something. So you have to talk about neighborhoods, you have to talk about wards. What you have to do is you have to articulate your conceptualization of resilience in a way that the local community can understand it. Why focus on resilience and why not focus on the specific challenges, food security, poverty, marginalization, voice, etc.? I think fundamentally, the learning that we've gathered from the rollout of the tool to date has been that in many of these communities, they often have things that they could be doing. They often have the opportunity to talk to local government. They often have the opportunity to influence national plans, but they lack the knowledge, they lack the information, and they lack a way to articulate that will actually enable them to have an influence. So the tool's not just a diagnostic tool about what to do, it's also a tool that generates learning and helps people engage in influencing. Most importantly, it doesn't just build on successes, it's also very open to failure. We're not going to make the right choices every time, we're going to make some wrong choices. And then the final point that I would like to highlight is this idea that it's locally led. It's putting the knowledge at the local community level, and it's really trying to help them understand what are the best choices that they need to prioritize to really build the resilience. It is hazard specific, and we are interested in exploring a multi-hazard framework. We're also interested in transferring it from floods to other hazards. That's my basic introduction, and I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Colin. It's great to have you here, another RMEL COP director or ex-director. Over to Garrett. I think just to add before we hand over to Garrett, that I've learned a lot from the Zurich's flood resilience measurement tool, from your work with practical action, but also from work that Garrett is doing with that. So you have a link there, and it's great to have you both. Garrett, over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Simona. And thanks everyone on the panel. What I really appreciate about all of this is that I think we all are learning from each other, and I think we're all converging around some of the same topics. And so I appreciate that. My name is Garrett Sheikey. I'm the Director for Innovation and Learning at Chorus International. And I really feel like I'm here to represent the voice of my colleagues and our partners globally who are really the experts and kind of agents of change in this process. Quickly, a bit of background on Chorus International, as it's likely new to most of you, and it's actually new to me as well. Chorus is the new parent of a family of organizations, each with a long history of supporting development efforts in the global south. Those family members include Lutheran World Relief, IMA World Health, Ground Up Investing, Farmers Markets Products, and Charlie Goldsmith Associates. And so I just wanted to add a little bit more on to some of the topics that Brad and Colin were hitting, and talk about how at Chorus we really look at how resilience measurement and strong resilience action go hand in hand. At Chorus, we have a culture of accompaniment, which at its core represents long-term relationship with partners globally based on trust, respect, and reciprocity. We really support partners and communities to strengthen the internal bonds and external relationships with actors such as government, private sector, and CSOs to facilitate collective action towards solving shared challenges. It really reflects the importance of social capital, which recognizes that strong and trusting relationships are necessary for important social capital outcomes such as pro-social actions, problem solving, conflict resolution, collective action, and really importantly, resilience. And in turn, those social capital outcomes are necessary precursors for accomplishing lasting development outcomes. As we all know, that resilience is not an end in and of itself. It's a means to an end. And so through accompaniment, we encourage viewing the world with a resilience lens that contributes to a deepening of a culture of resilience in all social groupings. I think what we recognize is that resilience is present and ongoing in the communities where we work, and it can and should take place even when outside support is not present. So a culture of resilience is really reinforced by consistently asking, the basic and relatively simple resilience questions. Resilience of what and for whom, resilience to what, resilience through what, and resilience in order to protect or promote what desired well-being outcomes. So by facilitating this culture of resilience, I think it really supports three key things. And those three key things are valuing the resilience capacities that are already present in the communities where we work, which is the to what and for whom. Helping to identify or frame the expertise needed to more deeply understand what has been proven to work through rigorous evaluation or resilience measurement, and that's kind of the through what. And then really at the end of the day, to encourage all of the actors within these systems to take collective action, see what works, learn from each other, and adapt over time with an eye on transforming societies and systems. And that's really the how. So I think we've all touched on a lot of it, and I just wanted to kind of throw that out there and kind of how do we conceptualize that, that resilience is you're never going to achieve resilience as an end state. It's going to be constantly in flux, and it's going to be changing. And how do we engage as actors within systems to continually be looking at this and create a culture of resilience over time?
Thanks,
leave it
Gary.
there.
That's great. I'll hand over to Alison. Alison, I remember fondly, I think 2 years ago, we were also in a panel together at the RMEL conference in New Orleans. And also then I think you were sharing lessons from your perspective from Resilience Alliance and from a socio-ecological systems perspective. So welcome to join you from that perspective again, or new insights probably. Over to you.
Thank you, Simona. And I also wanted to take a minute to thank Simona and Dorcas for inviting me to participate in this conference. It is worth stating, I guess, that I'm coming from a little bit outside with the Resilience Alliance perspective, a research network that focuses on social ecological sustainability. So definitely representing a stream of resilience research that comes from different origins. And I have learned a lot through this process. I'm with the Resilience Alliance. Sorry, I'll back up and introduce myself. I'm a senior research fellow with the Resilience Alliance, and I've really worked with the Resilience Alliance for most of my career. My background is in ecology, but also ecosystem services and human geography. And I did some of the early work on resilience assessment guides. In 2007, the Resilience Alliance produced the first workbook for practitioners, then updated in 2010. And then more recently, I worked with the grade program at the Stockholm Resilience Center, co-developing a wayfinder guide on navigating towards sustainable futures that brings together some of that earlier work on putting into practice resilience concepts, but also tailoring that to the extent that we could in more of a development context, or at least a broader context than the more traditional resource development that represented a lot of the origins of some of these concepts. And then pre-pandemic was able to start to do some training for the Wayfinder Guide in Bangladesh with IUCN, and then also in South Africa with the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at Stellenbosch University, and hope to be able to pick up some of that training again. And I guess for my contribution here on this panel, a couple of things, two things I really wanted to focus on. And one is I'm really encouraged with the direction in which things are moving in the resilience measurement, I guess, field, you could call it now. I'm encouraged with the increased attention being brought to engaging with complexity specifically and applying more of a social ecological systems lens. Obviously, you know, that's sort of where I'm coming from, but it is reassuring, I think, to see some of these terms that and concepts working their way into some measurement discourse. Specifically with the recent Human Development Report, I have a quote down here: "We must learn how to work with nature and ecosystems in ways which can support and sustain our global social aspirations." It's sort of this social ecological systems integrated perspective in which humans, as people being the focus of development, being embedded in these social ecological systems, is something that I think has the potential to really unlock opportunities for novelty in development. So one of the things, one of the things that I wanted to mention is Wayfinder has one approach to measuring resilience that briefly Dorcas had on a slide from some work that I did on the west coast of Canada with an Indigenous First Nations community, the Helsik First Nations, using the 7 principles of resilience in social ecological systems. And in terms of looking forward, this is work that I would like to do with the Resilience Alliance, and will continue to work on developing how these 7 principles are really dimensions of social ecological resilience can be used in more of a development context. How might some of the indicators that we developed for each of these principles, how might they change in different contexts, and what are missing? What are some of the dimensions that we might be missing? And I think only through actually starting to apply these in different cases and contexts can we move forward with further developing that approach. And I guess I think that it's worth mentioning too, in terms again of looking forward to recent papers, one that I've worked on with a colleague at the SRC, Meiselberg, on engaging complexity and resilience practice. This is still forthcoming, it's in review, but it provides specific examples of strategies that have been used in resilience assessment, planning, and practice that really do engage with complexity, using a complexity framework that others have developed to show how this has been done in 12 different cases and how we can move it forward. Because as everyone on the panel knows, it's really complicated and challenging and messy work that we're all engaged in. And the other one that I wanted to make a note of is by Stephen Lade, Brian Walker, and Jamila Haider on measuring pathway diversity as a surrogate for resilience. Again, there's an abundance of ideas around measuring resilience, but I think that they're exploring some interesting new terrain in terms of thinking about pathway diversity and future options as another surrogate or way of thinking about resilience that is worth exploring. And finally, I'll just close on saying that in 2014, the Resilience Conference in Montpellier that was hosted by CIRAD brought together different communities from resilience and development. And at that time, I remember resilience measurement being spoken about. And my first reaction was, well, that just shouldn't happen. That's not what resilience is about. And I just want to say that I've come a long way in my thinking. And I think through learning across these sectors and communities, we can really advance this. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Edison. And all the panelists, thanks so much. We went a bit over time, but I think it was very important to showcase the experience from various RMEL COP members, directors, on the role that resilience measurement plays in showing us what works and what does not in building resilience. I think we've come a long way. It's very complex, it's very complicated, it's messy. We have to learn from failure, as people notice as well. But it's great to know also and to know that we are not starting from scratch. We've had over 10 years and decades, if we include all this important socio-ecological systems research we can build on. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, and some of them are in the panel here today. Dorcas, with that, I'll close this panel. I'll hand over to you. Thanks so much, everyone. If you are available, please hang on until after the session when we stop the recording and we have a free Q&A with whoever is available and who's still interested. Okay, Dorcas, thanks.
Thank you, Simona. And thank you everyone for that panel. I'm now going to invite our next panel, who are going to focus a little bit more on locally-led adaptation and measurement for adaptation, and maybe compare and contrast a little with the first panel. So I'm welcoming Tamara Koja from the World Resources Institute, Carl Schultz from the International Platform for Adaptation Metrics, Tracy Kajumba from the International Institute for Environment and Development, and Anna Williams from the Climate Investment Funds and an independent consultant. Tamara, would you like to go ahead and get us started with your presentation? Simona, could you pull up Tamara's slides, please? Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dorcas. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Tamara Koja. I'm a senior associate at World Resources Institute, where I work on our climate resilience team and on the Global Commission on Adaptation, focusing on our work on locally led adaptation, which, as Dorcas and Salim reminded us, is the theme of this year's Gobeshona Conference. So I'm going to take a few minutes just to share some relevant findings and outcomes from the work that the Commission has been doing on locally led adaptation over the past year. And this action track was actually launched at Gobeshona last year, and the work that I'm going to present was actually born at a session at Gobeshona last year. So it's really great to have that come full circle and be here to present the outcomes of that work. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So just as some quick context, one of the recommendations that came out of the Global Commission on Adaptation's flagship report, Adapt Now, was for funders and governments to expand resources and support for locally led adaptation. And so to help move that recommendation forward, we've been working with a great network of partners, including many of those organizations who are represented here today: IIED, ICAD, GRP, Mercy Corps, SDI, many partners to develop these principles here for locally led adaptation. And the role of these principles is essentially to highlight what needs to happen to shift power to local partners. You know, what are the practices that need to change in order to enable more sustainable and effective adaptation at the local level? And thanks to this collective effort that we've had, we have significant support, and it's growing for these principles and organizations committing to move them forward, which is really great. So I just wanted to recognize that and let everyone know that there's a session on the 23rd for those who are interested in learning more about these principles specifically. Next slide, please. But to move to the topic at hand and how this relates to measuring resilience, to help put these principles for locally led adaptation into practice, one of the things that we've been working on is a set of recommendations for what is needed specifically for monitoring, evaluation, and learning to support locally led adaptation. So we developed this working paper that we're actually publishing next week, which outlines some recommendations and findings for how to do that. And again, thanks to those who are here. I know a number of you have contributed to this paper, so thanks for that. And why a focus on monitoring, evaluation, and learning when we're talking about advancing locally led adaptation, which is a diverse space. So as you all know well, probably being on this in this event, that adaptation requires managing complexity, uncertainty, context specificity, and that MEL is an important process for navigating these challenges for adaptation, and that includes locally led adaptation. It's also a process that involves power and decision making. And as such, it can either perpetuate structural inequities or it can actively work against them, which is what we want. And so what would it look like for MEL to both support resilience measurement and support more balanced power and decision making? So from our research and consultations that we've done, we propose these key overarching considerations that are listed here that are relevant throughout the MEL cycle. So come in different forms, whether it's through conceiving and designing a program to how we evaluate it and how we learn from successes and failures. So I won't go through each of these in detail, but just to provide a few examples of sort of what we mean by these recommendations, you know, in the context of locally led adaptation MEL, recognizing and responding to structural inequality is essential to be able to avoid bias in the outputs of the MEL process. You know, the metrics we use, how we define resilience and what we mean by successful resilience, making sure that the learnings that come out of the MEL process aren't biased towards those who have the most power. You know, when it comes to understanding climatic and contextual uncertainty and complexity, using scientific information to do that, but also making sure that we are working with those who have the firsthand knowledge of local context and using that local knowledge to inform those understandings of complexity. Generating value for local stakeholders, you know, we find that even participatory processes can be extractive if they don't generate value. So making sure that we're thinking about how the MEL process can create value at the local level. And prioritizing learning processes, you know, this has already been mentioned by Salim and Dorcas earlier, but that learning is an adaptation strategy in its own right. And so, and it's especially relevant in the context of locally led adaptation because of its role in building adaptive capacity at the local level. So those are a few kind of considerations that span throughout the MEL process that we find and that we discuss in this paper. And we also outline a few specific or a number of specific approaches, methods, and tools for each phase of the MEL cycle. So specific evaluation methods and learning approaches and tools that can be applied to help make sure that MEL is supporting locally led adaptation. And the bottom line is essentially that MEL of locally led adaptation requires a long-term systemic shift from traditional top-down MEL to MEL that is genuinely locally led. And that balances asymmetries in power and accountability. And and recognizing the limitations and kind of practical constraints that come with this, but that there are still practical steps and ways to navigate those trade-offs in order to strengthen locally led adaptation interventions. You can go to the next slide, please. So really quickly, I just wanted to, sort of looking ahead, highlight a few other relevant pieces to this discussion on both measuring resilience and advancing locally led adaptation. One is on tracking finance. So kind of separate but related to the MEL conversation is how we think about measuring the inputs to locally led adaptation. And one of the other things that we're working on at WRI is how we can think about advancing global tracking and reporting, both of the quantity of finance that reaches the local level, but also in order to make that meaningful, thinking about the quality of that finance as well. And, you know, thinking about metrics that we can use to understand the processes and decision-making that goes into allocating finance, and also different metrics of quality, such as patience, predictability, accessibility, et cetera, to make sure that that finance is actually designed to support locally led adaptation. And the next slide, please. And so thinking forward, what comes next, and just some other considerations that we're thinking about and talking about as we kind of continue this journey towards supporting locally led adaptation is one nuance that, you know, while locally led adaptation is about shifting power to local stakeholders, it's not about expecting them to shoulder the burden of adaptation. And so this is this really important element of investing in local institutions and local legacies, and making sure that you know, governments and local actors are equipped to make the decisions that we are saying they should have the authority to make, that they are equipped to use that climate information, et cetera. You know, of course, that we need to build the evidence base around locally led adaptation and share what we're learning, you know, continuing this great learning and knowledge exchange that we've been talking about and that has been going on for years, but including locally led adaptation in that, and elevating local knowledge and experience in those learning and knowledge exchange processes. And finally, that needing to embrace that the need for these systemic shifts and how we fund and design and implement and measure adaptation, but that there are also practical actions that we can take in the near term to start moving the needle. So that's sort of where I'll conclude here and turn it over to the rest of the panel, but look forward to further discussing. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. And yeah, thank you for highlighting some of those systemic shifts that are needed in terms of focusing on locally led adaptation and locally led learning for adaptation. It can feel at times as a tension between you know, metrics for high-level decision makers and forgetting that people on the front lines are high-level decision makers themselves. So I'd like to invite Carl to speak next. And I think we have then after that, Carl, we'll have Tracy and then Anna. If you could share, Carl.
Yes, thank you, Dorcas, and thanks, Simone, for having IPAM at this roundtable here. So I'm Carl Schultz. I'm with the Higher Ground Foundation, and I'm here on behalf of the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics as it's strengthening each other. When we're talking about resilience, I think we really have to, as Salim intimated, there's a relationship between resilience and adaptation. And when we're talking climate adaptation, you know, a large part of what resilience is really addressing the impacts of climate change for vulnerable communities at all scales. And I think it's important that we try to learn from the experiences and work alongside all of the experts who've been involved for some time on both resilience and adaptation. And that's what I hope I can do is call upon all of you to work together with the IPAM on trying to improve the state of adaptation metrics, so that we can have more impact at all levels. So let me just tell you a little bit about the IPAM and then talk about our starting point program that we have called AMY. So IPAM really, its pedigree comes from the Africa Conference of Parties back 4 years ago, held in Marrakesh, where the very first International Conference on Adaptation Metrics was held. Since then, every year there's been a conference, and on November of 2018, the question was raised amongst a group of experts that met in Rabat. Should we assemble a group that would focus on adaptation metrics to try to convene the experts to create a community of practitioners across sectors so that we could focus on better attracting finance and better understanding, really across scales and sectors, what would be the metrics and tools that would lead to more effective adaptation. So after that meeting, 5 different founding institution members joined together and launched the IPAM in May of 2020. What we have done since then is try to really organize a framework for membership across different types. And so we're now inviting institutional members and also associate members who are experts who can move their membership as their career advances from one organization to the other, to be involved in a collection of different committees that are focused on sectoral and transversal issues. To start out with, we have 3 different sectoral committees, one focused on cities, the other on water, and then also on agriculture. And we also have one transversal committee that's focused on tools and techniques. So what we're doing is we're trying to gather together various experts who would want to work on this to co-develop metrics and try to also consider the tools that can be done and respond to, and this is critical, and this is something that I'm very glad that virtually every panelist so far has talked about, and that is that you have to really be thinking about the user needs and who's really a stakeholder in adaptation. So to respond to those needs is critical. So I'd urge you to go to adaptationmetrics.org and see what we're about. And now I just want to conclude with a discussion over our inaugural program, which is what we call the Adaptation Metrics Mapping and Evaluation Project, or AMY. Its aim is to really map out what metrics exist currently and also evaluate it against criteria focused on user needs. We're focused initially on where we have the expertise, and so that's in cities, water, and agriculture, and also, though, inventorying the various tools and techniques. And these can be things like the use of remote sensors to the blockchain, and also different data platforms that may exist. We're hoping to create a taxonomy and really try to harmonize approaches, and so that at all scales we have some basis for trying to talk to each other and trying to measure. The AMY is focused on a modular approach, and so although we have a broader framework that will try to organize things, we're interested in really trying to look at, well, what interests are out there for different types of metrics mapping and evaluation so that we can serve those needs. The follow-on phase to this will be focused on really looking at how we can take the existing state-of-the-art on metrics and take it forward and build upon it so that we can have a better idea over what metrics may be necessary for the next 10 years, 20 years, and beyond. So I hope that's helpful. I'll put in a little chat our website so that you can learn more.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to turn over now to Anna, I'm sorry, I'm just looking who's online. Sorry, to Tracy Kajumba from IIED. Sorry, Tracy. If you'd like to share your thoughts with us now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorcas, for giving me this opportunity. I'm Tracy Kajumba. I work with the International Institute for Environment and Development as a principal researcher in the climate change group. So basically, our work is around climate and adaptation, and we've done work around climate finance, projects on decentralized climate funds and money where it matters. And the locally led adaptation principles largely come from this work. We also work with GRP and other partners on frontline funds to make sure that the local communities are accessing funds for adaptation. And we are also supporting the Least Developed Countries group with an initiative called the Least Developed Countries Initiative for Adaptation and Resilience. And in terms of measurement, IID has developed a number of frameworks for adaptation. One of them is focusing on tracking adaptation and measuring development, which was tested in 7 countries and was looking at the local to global measurement metrics and focusing on climate risk management at institutional policy and capacity level, and how that relates to vulnerability and development in terms of development performance. That was tested with lots of lessons coming out of that. And we've also done frameworks around SDG evaluation. And recently, last year, we published another framework we worked on, climate adaptation monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, which we codenamed CAMELS. And that was meant to support countries in ensuring the adaptation actions processes address the goals of meeting the Paris Agreement, supporting delivery of the SDGs, addressing climate risks within and beyond the Paris goal, and based on the climate science and projections within the countries. And from all these frameworks, some of them have been principle-based, and the term was largely on the practice. But there are key things that came out of this that link to the discussion we're having on the locally led adaptation principles. And in the other pieces of work we are supporting, even LifeAR has principles that they are working on adaptation, and looking at how these frameworks can support meeting adaptation either at national or local level. And we acknowledge that there are different frameworks coming up, but then what is the practice really for countries to lead to locally led adaptation? And we are doing some work with CEDA on the coherence between nature, climate, and SDGs. So bringing together the frameworks actually to respond to that principles becomes very important. So some of the lessons that came out of these frameworks is that most of the times we look at measuring adaptation from the outcomes, we don't look at the process. And that's where we really miss the point, because the quality of assessment and identification of adaptation needs, the MEL process should start with that. So that as we identify the climate risks based on national circumstances, that should be able to be factored into the MEL system. And then the CAMELS framework also brings out the importance of assessing the relevance and appropriateness of adaptation responses, which should be captured in the MEL system. And this was largely based on Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, making sure that you're able to assess the country adaptation gaps and have metrics that look at incremental adaptation or transformational, so that the actions and processes are really linking to the country level scientific evidence, the local indigenous knowledge relating to the hazards and impacts being experienced. The other key point that came out was the importance of tracking adaptation implementation progress, because most of the times we are chasing the money, how much money has gone into the countries, but then we don't critically look at the progress of implementation in terms of looking at policies, plans, and programs, and goods and services, for example, including capacity development activities to deliver more tangible support. So how do these frameworks speak to some of these key critical issues that come up from the countries? And also the MEL for adaptation needs to look at actions and processes in order to drive learning and inform policy, but also go beyond tracking and look at assessing effectiveness. Most of the work we're doing on money where it matters, it's looking at where the money goes, but then again, what does it do? Are the projects being prioritized, informed by climate risk assessments? Are they responding to adaptation needs of the communities where the money is going? Then assessing the impact of adaptation on development performance is also important, because under the decentralized climate finance program, especially when communities prioritize adaptation needs, some of them will sound like development because it's based on the public goods. If there's a drought, they don't have water, then they prioritize water. But then how do you assess the relationship between adaptation and development? And countries are supposed to report on SDGs, and climate is just one of those SDGs. So this coherence then becomes important. And the metrics really that could support adaptation need to look at the linkage between adaptation, SDGs, so that the reporting is coherent and the metrics and the frameworks can be brought together. Then the other lesson is capturing good practice, which others have spoken about. Identifying good practice through MEL, what is working, what is not working, in terms of reducing vulnerability, increasing resilience, enhancing adaptive capacity, and also ensuring that there is equity, the adaptation is equitable. We need metrics that look at issues like gender, like age, like other vulnerabilities and capacities that are required for adaptation, which should be part of the system to support good adaptation. But then there are challenges that came up as well in the processes as we interrogated the countries where we did this work. The policy and practice coherence becomes a problem. There's lots of pressure for countries to report and develop policies on different things. So you'll find indicators in the national development plans, and then they have climate policies where they have climate specific indicators. They are reporting on SDGs where they have to domesticate at national level. So this becomes a challenge where you find different systems scattered in different ministries, departments, and there's no system to bring together that at national level. And it becomes a burden for countries to actually support adaptation and measure it with that discorded work on measurements. And of course, there's been an issue of access to adequate finance. We've been raising this question to SEED as well, as much as donors are coming in to support us to develop frameworks, but it's of no use if we can develop so many frameworks and they're not being used. And at country level, they express the challenge that it's expensive to support some of these adaptation MEL. They need baselines, they need to collect information, they need to report, and sometimes they don't, most times they don't budget for the money. So how do we move from frameworks, as Tamara said, to the practical implementation and measurement of these principles of locally led adaptation is something that we need to think about. Then decentralized governance is also key, the top-down approaches, where we go with these frameworks, the communities have, and the governments have not been part of developing these systems. And then there's also even at national level where frameworks exist, they are done at national level. They don't involve the local structures and communities. And sometimes this enhances structural inequalities and exclusion in some of the responses and the measurements that we are talking about. The issue of capabilities and skills is also important. In the LifeAR work, we are looking at strengthening in-country capacity to be able to develop these frameworks and work with local communities and projects and the whole of government, bring in civil society to see where others can get involved in the process of tracking adaptation and focusing on resilience, not just the government alone, because then the top-down approaches can't be broken if we don't include others. And then the transparency and accountability, we are also thinking of, okay, we have all these frameworks. How can they support transparency and accountability in terms of like tracking the funds, getting in other actors into the process, and to assess how adaptation and resilience are effective at those different levels. Yeah,
Thanks,
so
Tracy.
that's what I would share. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. It's an incredibly complex proposition that you're laying out, isn't it? I mean, from the perspective of decision makers, metrics matter, but which metrics matter and within which system? Thank you so much. Anna, I'm going to invite you to share a few thoughts with us. If you could, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, Anna, go ahead, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's been a real pleasure to hear such expertise and wisdom, and also reflect upon how this field has grown over the past several years. And it absolutely has, and that's inspiring. So the thoughts I have to share in, I think 4 minutes, I have 5 thoughts to share, and it's really impossible to do them justice in just 4 minutes, but I'll do my best. First, thank you to both the organizers and to the speakers across the session. Tamara, a lot of what you shared resonates, and Carl and Tracy, your comments as well. So I'll try to be supplemental and in fact a bit provocative. And I hope Dorcas and Simone, you don't regret not only inviting me, but having me last as a panelist. So we all understand that resilience is context specific, very much so. So is transformational change. And that is what I have been focused on for the past 4 years, designing and leading a global transformational change learning partnership for the climate investment funds. It's been a true journey. We've learned a lot, and there's still so much to learn. But in addition to all resilience being context specific and local, we also know we need to tie that back up to the systems level, whether it's broader scalability in the context we're speaking of, sector regions, national, regional, and ultimately global. And to do this, donors and others also need to be aligned with this locally driven and context specific fundamental, while letting go of control of much of how that might be done, what that might mean, and even ultimately not just measurement, but concepts like returns on investment that may not even be as applicable when you really break this down to locally led adaptation and resilience. Measurement currently just falls short of the need, and it's also very challenging. We've known that for years, and that's not changed. It's extremely challenging to do this work, and we're losing the battle. So this is the context. We are losing the resilience battle. We're losing the climate battle, despite a few bright spots and perhaps trends that are optimistic. We really don't have time to wait to perfect this work. So a few points with that in mind. We've learned a lot about what being transformational really means in practice, including being extremely relevant to not just resilience, but to transformational change within that context. And that's a very different thing. Many of the actions being taken now are not going to get us where we need to go. And part of being transformational is really looking at that and taking very bold decisions and making investments that involve risk with no assurance of reward. Sometimes they're very inconvenient, including coming to terms with the reality that we may have to relocate entire communities rather than just do an incremental or marginal change that ultimately we don't have any reason to believe will stick. Climate smart agriculture is another example where sometimes that will fall short of the resilience approaches or responses. When we look at M&E, we're in a data poor environment. Methods are challenged. Many of the the quote gold standard methods are reductionist and oversimplifying. Not only that, they do, I believe, often, not always, but often overemphasize causality. That then in turn has a detrimental effect to what we can learn and ultimately do. So I know that's provocative, but I think it's pretty widely recognized as well. We have to be very careful about our assumptions within the evaluation space around things like external validity, or whether we really can make assumptions about, quote, what works, when what works is so context specific and itself changes over time. So, these are big challenges, but I want us to be real because we're in a window of time here with no time to waste, with an imperfect world of imperfect data and knowledge, and a crises upon crises where, our window of opportunity becomes even more constrained and the stakes are higher. I won't go into what the stakes are. I think the people on this session already understand a lot about that. But we do risk in the M&E and L field becoming irrelevant if we wait too long, if we really try to have things that cost too much and that aren't informed by real world uncertainties and real world sort of challenges around decision making in light of those uncertainties. That brings me back to the local level, and that's my final point, is simply that real, monitoring, evaluation, learning, we can even throw those words out. Just real adaptation and resilience must be done in full partnership, as we've all discussed, with local experts and actors, all types of knowledge and wisdom, broadening out and rapidly evolving in response. We can do that together. We can do that and be stronger together, even with global experts and locals working together. I do believe that the systemic change will be more powerful and lasting and ultimately more transformational. But we have a lot of work to do to get there. And I'll just leave it on that note, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Anna. And provocation is always good. You're making me think of somebody who was involved in the conference 2018 who said, we need to learn exponentially. We can't be talking about best practice. We have to be talking about next practice and doing it as we're talking. So I think you've highlighted the urgency and importance of that moving forward. In the interest of time, I'm going to hand back to Simona, but as she indicated, please do stay on if you would like to get involved in more of a chat after we formally wrap up. Thank you so much to all of you for speaking today. That was a fascinating second panel. Thank you. Simona.
Thank you, Dorcas, and thanks indeed to the second group of panelists. Thanks, Anna, for challenging us, but also for really highlighting the urgency of what we're all here to do. Resilience measurement, learning, transformational change is not easy, but it is important, and it's essential that we get it right. So thanks for that contribution and keep challenging us. I think we don't always have to agree with everyone, with each other, and we all have our own backgrounds, but we can agree on this, that it is important and we have to get things right. We are almost, well, we are actually at time, I guess. I want to give Nate 1 more minute to close. But indeed, as Dorcas says, please hang on. Some very brief action points are next steps on implementing the Resilience Knowledge Coalition that are on our agenda for this year. As you see, first, we are very keen to further co-develop and co-create and pilot coalition activities with you all. We are keen to expand the coalition membership and broaden the activity base. First step to this is indeed transitioning the RMEL COP into the coalition, and you receive a newsletter to that effect and what will happen, what it means for you as a member, and what are steps if you don't want to be involved any longer or if you want other people to join as well. Thirdly, with this expanded knowledge member base, we are keen to assess the knowledge needs and demands from the coalition members so that we are sure that we are doing things that are useful and are meeting that demand. And fourth, we are keen to come together at key events this year to further co-create the coalition. The next one is, well, the first one is still ongoing. We have a whole week almost of Gobeshona going on here. Please join as many sessions as you can. It's really interesting conference. And then on Monday, we have the Climate Adaptation Summit, but there's also community-based adaptation, CBA, BNC days. And finally, we're very keen to demonstrate results of the coalition and showcase them at the UN Food Systems Summit, and that's COP26, alongside our sister initiative, the Adaptation Research Alliance, who have their soft launch, I said before, I think Sunday, but it is Saturday, the 23rd. We have Rosalind on the line, and if you hang on, I'm sure she can answer some questions on that as well. So with that, without further ado, handing over to Nate for final closure. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you everyone again from myself and all of GRP for participating in this session, and also thank you from ECAD and South North and CDKN. I guess I would just like to emphasize, touching on some of the points I mentioned in the beginning. We've seen the fragilities of our current system have been really exposed by this pandemic. We know that we are living now in a world of increased uncertainty. And we should expect more shocks and stresses. And the $10 trillion that has been spent to date to stabilize systems, there's really little argument to say that that is actually building a resilient future. So the need for robust, resilient measurement is more critical than ever. And the only way that we'll be able to accomplish that is through our collective efforts. So we're really calling on all of you to join our Resilience Knowledge Coalition, help us ensure that we're more than the sum of our parts, and help us win this battle, as Anna put it. So without further ado, I'll pass it back to Simona if there's any final words, but thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to more conversations like this. Thanks.
Thanks for joining, but I see we still have Salim on, so maybe we can kick off our formal Q&A. Salim, if you still have some, and you're still with us, if you want to give us some closing remarks as well, or to kick off the discussion with the Q&A, feel free to.
If you don't mind, Simona, thank you. I'd like to just share a few concluding remarks. Yeah, I'll have to go off to another session. So thank you very much. This was an extremely, I thought, fascinating session with excellent presentations. The one area that I would like to just, if I may take a minute or two to share our, if you like, a narrow part of the larger resilience measurement arena that many of you are involved in. And that is to do with the self-measurement of adaptation and resilience by vulnerable communities. Right? So our interest is in developing methodologies that do not evaluate from the outside what is happening and who is become resilient or not become resilient, and imposing standards on them, but to enable people who are doing the adaptation and building their resilience to themselves figure out what it is that they want to achieve, how they want to do it, and how they themselves, without an external monitor or a donor-funded evaluator flying in to evaluate, they themselves can measure their own progress over time. And the purpose of this is to measure progress over time of the community itself. This is not an evaluation by a donor of value for money, or comparing one country with another country or one place with another place. Those are constructs that are external to these people. So our primary focus is how do we enable, empower, capacitate, facilitate the community to figure out for themselves what they want to do, collect the data information that they need to do it, and over time do their own self-evaluation of their own progress and self-corrections. If they've done something wrong that didn't work, what else do they need to do that does work? And it requires a longer-term relationship with them over time. It's a partnership over time, building trust over time. And they are the client. The donor is not the client. The people are the client, and we are trying to help them. And we are trying to learn from them as well. So for us, it is a matter of how do you capture experiential knowledge in a manner that can be useful. So to us, I would say 90 to 95% of our effort is capacitating and enabling people to do things themselves. And then the additional few percent is our agenda of, is there something happening here that is of global significance or more general significance or academic significance that we can extract from a particular case study and share that knowledge with others going forward. And an example of doing this is the one I mentioned at the very beginning, which was a meta-analysis of a set of stories. We had 30 or 40 stories of different organizations and groups of people doing all kinds of things around the world. And we looked at them and we talked to them and we tried to distill 3 sort of common modalities that seem to be useful across a number of them. And that's what we published in our policy brief. But the purpose wasn't doing that. The purpose was to help them, enable them, and it still remains how to support them going forward. And the extraction of knowledge is a secondary objective, not the primary objective. Anyway, I thought I'd share that with you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this session.